Hello, folks. My name is Dr. Troy Rogers, and I am a police and public safety psychologist in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I run Public Safety Psychology Group, and we work with 150 federal, state, local law enforcement, probation, parole, corrections, fire, paramedic, EMT folks in our area. I've been asked today to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the current state of the situation in the United States in terms of the quarantine and folks being asked to stay in their home and the outbreak and how that psychologically can affect folks and at some level what we can do to overcome some of the difficulties inherent in that. Before I get started in that area, I always want to kind of do a disclaimer for folks who've never heard me speak. I am a psychologist, but I often tell folks I'm not a normal psychologist in that I don't see myself as being kind of a touchy-feely guy. I tend to use humor a whole lot. I will cuss by accident and then get corrected later. So as I go through kind of this discussion, I want folks to know that ahead of time, that I'm not making light of any of the things I'm going to be talking about. But I found that kind of humor is a tool to help cope with situations, especially difficult situations. And a lot of the folks that I work with use humor on a regular basis to manage high levels of stress and increased struggles due to the anxiety, the frustration, the fears that they see on a regular basis. So I always put that disclaimer at the front of my trainings because my goal is not to offend or to rub somebody the wrong way. So in terms of the COVID-19 situation, some of the things that you can expect is uncertainty. You can expect folks to have fear, folks that maybe you've look to feel comfortable in your life, all of a sudden are kind of a little bit on edge, don't really know where things are going to go. One of the difficulties with a situation like this is we have a playbook or a checklist for things, but the world has never really seen this exact situation. And so our checklist or our playbook isn't always correct, and it may change, which creates frustration and more uncertainty. We see 1 week suggestions that say you should not be wearing safety masks because there's a shortage, and then 3 or 4 weeks later we're told we should be wearing them to help control the spread. And when people see that uncertainty increases. We're seeing a lot of folks with extreme opinions on both sides of the topic. We're underreacting, no, we're overreacting, which creates an inherent conflict in folks in their daily interpersonal interactions. And those conflicts can become highly problematic in many ways, even when they're controlled, because they act to create more fear in other folks. We tend to be a society which avoids conflict. And so when situations like this arise and conflict comes to the surface, it makes us that much more uneasy. We also are being bombarded with information overload. We're being sent stories on our phones. The internet has any and all information that we want. We watch TV. The newspapers all have bits and pieces of information that in some ways we probably want, but we probably psychologically really don't want it. It's kind of like driving by that car accident. There's really no good reason to look, but our curiosity peaks and we look. And a lot of times we're going to see things that maybe we don't want to see. And at the end of the day, that information that's being put out there has all kinds of different sources. Some of them good, some of them bad, some of them positive intentions, some of them financial intentions. So it becomes kind of this wave of information that can influence our emotions. We probably start to experience more irritability. When I talk about public safety folks, they're seeing this from two or three different kind of angles. One is in their homes, in their quarantined kind of small space, they're seeing the effects on their family, their children. But then they also go out into the world and they're seeing that reaction in others. We're already starting to see alcohol consumption and purchases going up statistically. We've started to see an increase in domestic violence disputes, which is not necessarily surprising. We've changed people's habits at home. Folks who maybe interacted with their significant other 4 or 5 hours a day are now stuck in a 600 square foot apartment with somebody they care about for 10, 15 hours. My wife routinely tells me that I need to leave the house so we get along better because we have different personality styles. And in a situation like this where we're quarantined, those personality styles have have a higher likelihood of clashing. So expect that. Expect that the idea of change in and of itself is difficult for most folks. This is outside of what people are fully kind of prepared to deal with. I'll give you a personal example. One of the ways I deal with stress is my son and I will go watch movies. Well, we can't go watch movies anymore. So we've got to go home to watch movies, or we've got to go to the living room to watch movies. That's a change. That change has removed some degree of control in our coping mechanisms or our lives, and it's created an adjustment period. Another thing you can expect from situations like this is bad information. Folks don't really have the playbook, so when information is put out, it may not have a whole lot of factual basis, or it's just an idea or a theory. So we've got to be real careful that we don't become impatient with information and run with things that are not helpful. We're also seeing folks that are slowly starting to come out of the woodwork who are trying to profit on a bad situation. So folks become more and more guarded because they're worried about what lurks behind the door. Who's out there trying to take advantage of me? What is this about? So that creates more and more of that fear. Financial issues. Folks starting to think about what happens now, but also what happens in 4 months when my job's not there, or my boss can't pay me, I can't pay rent. All those dynamics create more and more emotional stress. So now that I've kind of created some depression in everybody who's watching this, let's talk about the positive side. How do we manage this crisis? How do we work through the crisis? I have a lot of kind of experience coaching kids, and one of the things that I've learned as a psychologist is much of what I do in my professional life mirrors how I coach in my personal life. And one of the first things I do at the beginning of each season, when I bring kids in, and I coach, I'm a high school wrestling coach, and as we bring the kids in the first couple of days, we start to explain to our kids the difference between being hurt and being injured. And a lot of folks will ask me, well, what's the difference? The difference between being hurt and being injured is when you're hurt, it's difficult, it's tough, it doesn't feel good, but it doesn't stop you from performing or from pushing or from working through difficulty. When you're injured, you've got to stop because it's going to get worse, or we need to treat it or do those sort of things. I see situations like this in much that same way. We're hurting, so we've got to find ways to adapt. We've got to find ways to increase resilience. We've got to find ways to accept that the situation is difficult, but we're going to overcome it. Some of the ways we can do that is we turn off the TV. We limit how much of that information overload we allow into our lives. We limit the sources. We don't allow folks to interject fear into our heads. Because one of the things we know about fear is it releases chemicals in our body, which actually makes it more difficult for your body to fight illness. So we've got to stop that fear. We stop the fear by developing routines each day. We still set our alarms in the morning, even though we may not have anywhere to go. We've got to get up. We've got to create a list of productive ways to accomplish tasks. We've got to acknowledge that our world has a new normal. And that new normal is something we're all figuring out on the fly. Nobody's an expert at it. So we've got to remove our own self-judgment. We've got to kind of, in some ways, take each hurdle with a grain of salt. We can use humor to do that, but sometimes humor creates problems. So for a lot of my public safety kind of folks that are watching this, your normal coping mechanism may be compromised in some ways because that humor may trigger others. I always tell folks, go to bed at a reasonable time in situations like this. Keep that routine. Try to exercise. Gyms are closed, but what can I do at home? What can I do in the backyard? How do I get outside? Because being outside is going to help kind of refresh your mind, your body. How do I eat healthy when it's just as easy to throw something in the microwave as it is to actually cook a meal? Try to take breaks. It's okay to utilize some degree of denial and distraction within reason. Distract yourself. This weekend, I had the opportunity to sit down with my son and play video games. And we played video games for 3.5 hours. And in some ways, I thought to myself, this is a waste of 3.5 hours. And then I realized after the fact that the 3.5 hours wasted was the best 3.5 hours of the weekend. Because it was a distraction. It was an opportunity to connect in a world where we're being told we can't connect with people right now. And that's another thing we need to do. Find ways to connect. Stay in touch with family. Stay in touch with friends. We have technology that will help with that. But we've got to allow ourselves emotionally to maintaining those connections. Focus on flexibility. In times like this, rigidity creates psychological struggles. So we've got to find ways to be flexible with what the world throws at us. How do we adapt? How do we create new hobbies which are going to help us feel more in control? At the end of the day, I think I'm trying to kind of put out a fairly simple message. Be logical with what's going on. Try to manage the fear through things like hope or believing that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Develop resilience and recognize that at this point we're hurting, okay, but we're not injured. And we can keep fighting towards that outcome that's going to make us feel better. Rely on your resources that are available to help you cope, whether that be contacting a counselor or therapist, public safety psychology group. We are open for business right now. We're doing telehealth, Zoom sessions, phone sessions. We're also doing face-to-face with a little bit of extra space. We're working with folks on a regular basis to help them continue to cope with these difficult times. Use your peers. They're walking in your shoes. Reach out to them. Talk to them. Ask for advice on how they're coping. There are hotlines, crisis lines. Use those resources if it gets to a point where you need that. I always tell folks there's no right way to survive a crisis, but there's healthy ways to survive a crisis. So make sure you're tapping into those healthy ways. Thanks in advance for taking the time to listen to what I have to say. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. My office number is 505-888-5499. My email is t.rogers, RODGERS, at pspg-nm.com. Good luck, folks. Stay safe.